Now, infighting and chaos continue to grip Libya 3 years after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi. The center can no longer hold. A loose alliance of militias known as Libya Dawn now control the capital, Tripoli. In the east, a new rival government is being set up.
In Libya, the center can no longer hold. Prime Minister Abdallah al-Thani stepped down to end the power struggle in the country. He was promptly reappointed to office. His departure appeared to trigger a dangerous power vacuum as Libya seemed to be in a freefall. Now, there is real danger that Africa's once most prosperous country could slide further into anarchy and, more worryingly, a civil war. 3 years after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, instability and chaos continues to grip Libya. Armed groups which united against Libya's longtime leader have refused to disarm, leaving the government unable to exert control. The post-revolution transition now hangs in the balance. The country is now polarized between two main factions of competing militia brigades and their political allies. In the east, a new government, largely recognized by the international community, is taken. In Tripoli, a militia group, the New Dawn, has taken control. The Islamist-linked militia, which seized the capital last week, has called for the elected MPs to be replaced by the previous body, the General National Congress. The Arab League has described the situation in Libya as being in a critical stage and called for an immediate ceasefire. Successive post-Gaddafi governments have all failed to put in place the necessary institutions to govern Libya. Like Africa's late literary icon Chinua Achebe would put it, the center cannot hold. Such is the case in Libya today. In the North African country, the balance which holds all the varied elements of a world in equilibrium have been lost, and everything is unraveling.
So is Libya on the brink of civil war? Are the deep political divisions in the North African country also exposing a growing rift between regional Arab states? To discuss this issue, we're joined from Cairo by Dr. Ziad Ahmed, a researcher at the Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies in Tehran, Professor Mohammed Miranda, an Iranian academic, political analyst, and an expert on American studies and Orientalism. Professor Miranda is also an associate professor of English literature at the University of Tehran. In Washington, D.C., Dr. Edmund Garib, an expert in Middle Eastern affairs. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I'll start off with you, Dr. Ziad Ahmed in Cairo. Now, Tripoli's international airport has fallen. Tripoli itself appears to have slipped almost completely out of the government's grip. Now, in 2011, it was about deposing Muammar Gaddafi. Perhaps as a starting point to this discussion, what exactly is the new conflict about? Is it ideological, religious? Is it regional? What is it? What is the conflict about?
Well, it seems that it's purely political. It keeps thinning, actually, the content of the conflict now. So it's not exactly, or it's not solely ideological. I mean, there is, of course, an ideological content when it comes to the elements inside this conflict that actually do subscribe to some kind of a radical Islamic ideology. But it is not exactly geographical. It is more of a war for survival between different political players, really, that are just trying to set their own politics in tune. Whether all the other parts just become really sort of supporting components, but the main content is not just ideological or just geographical or just even tribal based. It is more of a really a political conflict.
All right, Professor Miranda, though, what do you make of the murkiness, though, of this situation? I mean, we are also hearing of a dozen commercial airlines, planes now having gone missing. We're hearing of militant groups like Ansar al-Sharia, allegedly with links to the IS. What do you make of all this?
Libya is a tragedy, and while Gaddafi was not a leader that one could admire, what the Americans and NATO did to Libya was far worse than what the old dictator had done in the past. The United States and the Europeans have destroyed the country, the infrastructure of the country, and more importantly perhaps is the fact that they began filtering weapons and money into the country for groups that supported their agenda during the civil war in the country. So now you have a state of affairs where there is no longer a central government. The country is in chaos. You have different groups vying for control. And at the beginning of the civil war itself, one major disastrous policy shift that we saw in NATO and the United States, among many others, was that they began cooperating with extremists, former Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda members who were introduced to them by the Qataris, and these same people went on to support the Free Syrian Army later on in Syria. But this policy shift basically helped to encourage the rise of extremism in Libya itself. You see forces very closely aligned to Daesh or ISIL now forming bases in Libya. So it is a country that's fallen apart. It no longer exports any substantial amount of oil. The people are completely depressed. People are fleeing the country. And this is basically the fault of the United States and the Europeans, but they will not admit it, nor will the Western media.
Dr. Garib, this is the fault of NATO. This is the fault of the United States. What they've done to Libya is far worse than what Muammar Gaddafi is alleged to have done to Libya. Do you agree?
Well, I don't know if it's worse, but clearly in the intervention, the interference in the internal affairs of Libya, the regime change policies have contributed to the chaos that we are seeing in Libya today. And if Libya is not in a civil war, at least it seems to be sliding towards that. I think that what we have seen is that the Western intervention, NATO's intervention in Libya, has created a vacuum. This vacuum, for a large extent, we're seeing different militia forces, different ideological forces, tribal forces, regional forces are attempting to fill. There is a struggle for power going on. And in many ways, it's similar to what we saw, and to a certain extent. Of course, it's very different in Syria, where this conflict, while there is clearly an internal dimension to it, there are, and that's probably the main dimension. However, we're seeing regional actors, regional players are also supporting different factions, and that contributes to the greater volatility, greater violence, and we see a proxy wars going on within Libya, as we're seeing in Syria and in some other places. And that makes it extremely dangerous. And the Libyan people, unfortunately, like the Iraqi people before them, like the Syrian people, are the ones who are paying the heaviest price.
All right. Dr. Akil, there, though, we're seeing regional actors there supporting different factions, according to Dr. Garib there. The involvement of Egypt, I mean, there was a talk a few weeks ago that from the United States, it's alleged that Egypt and the United Arab Emirates had, sent in strikes into Libya, although those countries have since denied. Who are the actors in the region now involved in the Libyan crisis?
Well, it seems, of course, that all the neighboring countries of Libya have recently agreed that there will no longer be a unitary action, that the number and the intensity of regional meetings that have been held for the neighboring countries of Libya, there was one in Cairo about 2 weeks ago. There was one before it in Tunisia, one before it in Algeria. And the problem is really that the nature of the threat coming out of Libya is itself has changed. So while simply before the danger or the threat was simply one of border relationships, now it's not a matter simply of border security. So definitely you would find Egypt and Tunisia and Algeria are the most effective regional actors in the equation right now, but because there is a very tight connection between the general fight against terrorism in the Middle East and how Libya could become a potential for such terrorism to grow. So this is why you would actually find other Gulf countries are also involved in the equation.
Dr.
But what really happened, I mean, the extent of the truth about the involvement of the direct or military involvement of Egypt and the UAE in Libya is not really completely figured out till now. I mean, the countries deny, the US first, said that this happened, and then they went back and said, no, that this did not happen. So we can't really tell whether this happened or not, but certainly these two countries, the UAE and Egypt in specific, are two of the main players and are two of the countries that will be some sort of an entrance gate for any intervention in Libya in the coming period.
All right, Professor Miranda, though, it is speculation there, though, about a regional intervention. But is there a proxy war, though, happening in Libya? How are you looking at the regional intervention in Libya?
Again, you know, the United States, by intervening, as was said before by one of your guests, rightly so, the United States, by intervening in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and and other countries as well through drones and airstrikes, they've opened a can of worms. And basically, sovereignty and international law no longer means much in this region anymore, thanks to the United States. In Libya, we do have a proxy war. On the one hand, of course, there are countries like Qatar and Turkey who, at the moment, seem to have the upper hand in this battle, and countries like the Emirates and Egypt and Saudi Arabia are, so far at least for the time being, more on the losing side. But this is really the tragic part of the story, and that is that the whole notion of intervening to such a great degree is something that is new. We've always had interference among countries in this region and in others, but it's reached a completely new level altogether in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, and so on, and Yemen as well. And this is leading to the collapse of the region. And on the other hand, you have countries, oil-rich Arab dictatorships, that are promoting extremist ideologies. And those extremist ideologies are such as Wahhabism, is itself like fuel that will just increase the fire, as we see in Libya. So ironically, you see extremist groups in Libya fighting against those who the Saudis support, but ideologically they are in fact somewhat similar to Saudi Arabia.
All right. So is there a feeling, though, Professor Miranda, is there a feeling in the region that there is a sort of vacuum emerging after NATO or after the United States influence, though, began to wane in the region, hence the need for that regional intervention, and that's the proxy wars?
Yes, without a doubt. Right now what we're seeing is the collapse of the infrastructure of a host of countries. This began, of course, well, at least one of the countries that this began with was Afghanistan, when the United States and the Soviet Union were at war with one another during the Cold War. And the country was destroyed, the infrastructure of the country was destroyed, children no longer went to school, and the country was set back decades. And as a result, and as a result of continued interference through extremist groups in Pakistan and the madrasas that were created again by oil-rich Arab countries, you had the rise of the Taliban ultimately, which brought about the devastation that we saw. So when the infrastructure of a country like Libya is destroyed, when the country no longer has any center, then the country will deteriorate, and the next generation of people will be less educated, less well off, and then you will have greater opportunities for extremists to grow. And I should add that regardless of how awful the previous dictator Gaddafi was, one extra problem is that in the past, a lot of the terrorist activities or extremist activities in North Africa were monitored by the Libyan regime and other regimes, but there's no longer any more center to control these activities. So what the Europeans have done has basically caused a major threat to their own security.
All right, Dr. Garib?
Yes, clearly. I think it's very important what we're seeing now. This is a dangerous development. One of the, what I find extremely worrisome in a sense is that right now some of the neighbors of Libya are becoming very much concerned about the internal security, not only inside Libya, but about their own internal security. What we are seeing, we're beginning to hear even from a country like Algeria, some of the analysts, commentators are becoming very much concerned about the implications and the spillover effect of the conflict from Libya to their own country. And there have been some analysts saying that the Algerian military, which has so far avoided interference in the external affairs of some of their neighbors, may not continue to do so, especially if they feel that some of the radical extremists are going to begin to move to their own country. Some of the militias that we are seeing operating in Libya, some of them have to do with some ethnic and tribal background. Some of them, of course, are ideological, and some of them reflect the old regional realities of Libya. And this is where the danger also that Libya, if this continues, if this escalates, we could go back to the period where before even the monarchy, when the country was divided to 3 different regions.
All right, Dr. Edmund Garib in Washington, Professor Mohammed Miranda in Tehran, and Dr. Ziad Ahmed in Cairo. Gentlemen, do stay with us. We'll return in a moment. Welcome back to the program. So what is the danger of a broken Libya for the wider Arab world? And what can be done to salvage the country? Still with us on the program from Cairo, Dr. Ziad Ahmed, a senior researcher at Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies in Tehran, Professor Mohammed Miranda, an associate professor of English literature at the University of Tehran, and in Washington, D.C., Dr. Edmund Garib, an expert in Middle Eastern affairs. Gentlemen, welcome back to the program. Dr. Ahmed, to you now. The government in Libya there seems to have lost complete control of the country. How do you stop Libya, though, from sliding further into anarchy?
Well, I think that any attempt to actually do something to stop Libya from sliding further into anarchy has to take into consideration the different, the balance of power between the different political players inside of Libya. So there cannot be any real attempt to stop sliding into chaos without finding some kind of a coordination between the different militias and the institutional state. So with whatever state institutions left in Libya, with the very unique meaning of institution in the Libyan case, or of state institution in the Libyan case, these state institutions have to actually have some kind of a dynamic between the different militias that support the return of the state, and also between the different tribes that support the state. So basically, there is no one single element inside of Libya that could control the whole scenario. So basically, what seems to be the most sort of scenario that would have a lot of support from the regional neighbors of Libya is a scenario where the state, some militias, some tribes are actually supported by the neighboring countries of Libya to represent the legitimate centers of power inside of Libya.
All right. Professor Miranda, from your end, though, your view was Libya is much worse off now as a result of the US and the NATO allies. But is it now possible to stop, though, Libya from sliding into a further anarchy? From your perspective, though, what would it take to achieve an end to this crisis from the region?
A return to international law, which is something that the Americans have really wrecked, despite the fact that international law, as we know it, was devised by the United States and its allies, and it's basically been Eurocentric, but they cannot even abide by that. Basically, the United States destroyed Syria because of its disregard for international law. Instead of trying to bring peace and the different parties together to find a solution, the United States tried to support any group that opposed the Syrian president, and therefore this monster that we see as a result indirectly has been created, meaning Daesh or ISIL. The same is true in Iraq, and now we see the same is true in Libya. What Libya needs right now is for the regional countries basically to halt arming the different groups and to bring them together for some sort of reconciliation and elections to be held. And foreign countries have to stop funding the militants. And also, pressure has to be put on these oil-rich Arab dictatorships that promote Wahhabism, which is a very extremist and dangerous ideology that's spreading not only in Libya but across Africa and Asia, like Boko Haram and so on. So a lot has to be done, but Libya is a country with a population of maybe less than 6 million, and its oil is the most valuable light crude in the world. It's very rich in resources, and if the international community really wanted to solve the problem, they don't need to fund the country. The country would really very quickly become the most wealthy country in Africa.
All right. Dr. Garib, is it a good thing, though? I mean, your perspective on this, and do you think it's a good thing that the United States takes a backseat on this one, particularly against the, its waning influence now in the region?
Well, a great deal will depend on what kind of actions the United States takes. I don't think the United States by itself can resolve Libya's problems, but I think the United States, in a way, as did the Europeans who intervened, have been forced to evacuate their embassies, and that in itself is not necessarily, it does not indicate that the policies which have been pursued have been very successful. Nevertheless, I think the United States is still a major player. The United Nations could play a role bringing together members of the Security Council of the United Nations, bringing together especially the neighbors of Libya to try to mediate, to try to reconcile the different parties, to try to get the main players in Libya to sit down together. So basically what we need to do is first to stop the intervention in terms of providing either some financial support or providing other diplomatic or political support, because there are weapons that had been taken, in fact, many of them from the arsenal of Colonel Gaddafi's forces. Right. And then some of these weapons even made it through Turkey and to Syria, etc. So basically that has to stop. The second thing, to try to hold a conference in order to bring the different parties together, because unless you get everybody represented, you're going to see continued violence and fighting inside Libya.
All right, Dr. Garib, we're going to wind up in a moment, but I want to get your final comment on this. Do you think, though, it is time now that the region took care of its own problems? Because we're watching Libya disintegrate. I mean, we've seen the problems in Iraq as well. We've seen the problems in Syria. Is it time now that the region took care, though, of its own problems?
Clearly, the leaders of, and so to a certain extent, we cannot, the people even sometimes are responsible for what we have seen. There's no doubt that the external interventions have made things much, much worse in many ways, as we have seen, starting with Afghanistan, going to Iraq, going to Syria, going to Libya. There was the Arab Spring, but it's not, the Arab Spring wasn't there in every place. In some countries, there were really legitimate opposition forces that had a representation on the ground, and they wanted to see at least some change. In other places, it was, however, the interventions by outsiders who helped arm, support, finance groups, which brought down, to bring down regimes that were basically perceived as being hostile to the interests of either some of the neighboring countries or to the countries in Europe or in the United States. This has to stop. I think the people in the region must be allowed to carry the burden of trying to reform their own societies and move forward.
All right, Professor Miranda, it is your assertion that NATO and the United States interference there has left Libya, a basket case, has left Libya worse off than during the times of Muammar Gaddafi. In your view, though, now, is it time that the region took care of its own problems?
Well, definitely. I think that a major part of the problem is the United States. It is the EU. The fact that they deem themselves to be culturally and superior, to be intellectually superior, they have a very Eurocentric worldview. And therefore, they have a history of supporting dictatorships because they see it as in their interest to have these dictators in power. And then when there are governments or regimes that are somehow in conflict with Western countries, they see it as legitimate for them to break international law and intervene and destroy these countries. So basically, the United States and the Europeans are very much part of the problem. Without a doubt, of course, there are also regional problems. As I said, the extremism that we see that's on the rise throughout the region and beyond is something that has to be dealt with. Wahhabism is becoming a global threat now. But I do think that if the United States and the Europeans really behaved in a more responsibly manner, without a doubt the problems that we have in this region would be much more easy to manage. And that is one reason why I really think that in the case of Libya, the real way forward is for the neighboring countries to step forward and to try to help the Libyan people find a solution, because there is very little respect for the UN anymore, or the United States government or the EU. And if the problem in Libya is to be solved, the people of Libya and neighboring countries have to come together and save the country. As I said, the country has extraordinarily large amounts of resources, and it's not a very highly populated country. The problem can be solved.
All right, gentlemen, we leave it there for the moment, but I do thank you all for being on Talk Africa. Dr. Ziad Ahmed, a senior researcher at Akram Center for Political and Strategic Studies, joining us from Cairo. In Tehran, Professor Mohammed Miranda, an Iranian academic, a political analyst and an expert on American studies and Orientalism. And in Washington, D.C., Dr. Edmund Garib, an expert in Middle Eastern affairs. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being on Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Goodbye.